Well, again, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Mitchell, and I have the honor of serving as one of the elders here at Redeemer Fellowship. May 6th, 2023. May 6th. Anybody, by just a show of hands, know what's happening on May 6th of this year? I mean, any number of things are happening, but significant. Now, as an American, I'm not technically supposed to show any interest in the happenings surrounding this date, having settled this matter on the other side of the Atlantic some 250 years ago. However, given the significance of the moment, I'll set aside whatever patriotism I hold just for a second. May 6th is actually the day set for the coronation of King Charles III. And it's this in-between phase of both mourning and preparation I find so interesting. Quite literally, Charles became king the moment his mother died on September 8th. But it won't be for 8 months before his coronation. Interestingly, Queen Elizabeth waited 16 months after the passing of her father before her own coronation. The day after his mother's passing, Charles made his first public address, and it was then the day after that he was proclaimed king. Certainly, there has and will be quite a bit of planning between now and May. I assure you, I have not been privy to any of it, though. What I can tell you is that when Elizabeth was crowned in 1953, more than 8,000 guests attended, some 40,000 troops, and not one, not two, but 24 military bands played a part in the ceremony. It was, to be sure, quite the to-do. The fanfare and pomp associated with these events is really unmatched in our world. But compare that with what we saw here at the beginning of John chapter 19. Where's the pomp? Where's the fanfare? Does Jesus walk right into the Sanhedrin or Pilate's office, proclaiming his resurrection? Does he display his glory to large crowds? What do we actually see? Who does he reveal himself to? 2 weeks ago, we saw Jesus' trial as an ironic display of his kingship. He was put on trial where he was found innocent of sedition and treason before a Roman magistrate. He was then crowned and robed. He was proclaimed king in 3 different languages. Then, last week, we saw as he was led on his kingly procession to the top of a hill where he was displayed for all to see. His majesty, his glory, his incomparable splendor as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We saw the day of his coronation as the day of his death. So now what? What does John, the beloved disciple, now show us in the wake of Jesus' trial, coronation, and death? The title for today's sermon is Revealed in Time. And we'll see that in a moment where we would expect a triumph with fanfare and banners and fireworks, maybe not fireworks, we see the opposite. We see what some might consider to be an anticlimax. We see the rightful king of all that is and was and ever will be, acting in a way that should give us pause to consider. We'll look at John chapter 19, verses 38 through chapter 20, verse 19, in 3 parts. So those of you who are taking notes, I boiled it down to 3 simple words, and my wife was disappointed that they don't start with the same letter, but here we go. Preparation, confusion, and revelation. Again, preparation, confusion, and revelation. Preparation, John 19, verses 38 to 42. Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in all 4 Gospels as one of those in religious authority over Israel and heightened social standing. He would have had more ready access to Pilate and other Roman authorities, certainly more than Jesus' disciples would have. Executed criminals were routinely handed over to their next of kin, but not if the sentencing involved was sedition, treason, as was the case of Jesus. The idea that Pilate would hand Jesus' body over mere hours after his accusation of treason further drives home what we saw 2 weeks ago. Pilate clearly saw Jesus as innocent. The number and amount of aromatic spices brought was considerable. If my math is correct, it's always suspect. If my math is correct, it's approximated at 75 pounds, 34 kilos. Compare this to the woman who brought the pure nard to anoint Jesus' feet in John chapter 12, verse 3. Her gift had been worth 300 denarii, or 1 year's wages. The amount of spices Nicodemus brought was the equivalent of 30,000 denarii. Roughly the wages one could hope to accumulate in 100 years. Literally a full lifetime. The lavish amount of spices here are as befits a king. Even in his trial, even in his crucifixion and his death, and now we see again in his burial, Jesus is hailed as king. And while burials in gardens also have precedent in the Old Testament and other writings, and I would be happy to point to cultural significance of gardens in the Old Testament as context, John doesn't do that here. He doesn't point to the cyclical nature of life in a garden where we see death and life come each season. He doesn't point to the way God himself makes things grow. He doesn't point to the Garden of Eden or to the lush gardens of Solomon at the height of Israel's affluence, or even to the Garden of Gethsemane the night before. What we see here is that it was not the religious significance or the cultural significance that John points to. It's the proximity and the need for Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus to get the job done before the Sabbath began at nightfall. It's a proper burial, and it's done the right way. It is lastly significant to note in this section that this private tomb, so close by, is one in which no one had ever been laid. Why is this significant? It's significant to the testimony of Mary and the disciples, as we'll see in a moment. If the tomb is empty on Sunday, and only one body had ever been laid in it, then there is only one person who has been resurrected. It's pointing to the idea that Jesus alone was there and Jesus alone is now not there. But back to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus for a moment. John's gospel makes no mention of Joseph before or after Jesus' burial. Nicodemus is mentioned on a couple of occasions, and you might remember from our sermon series. He met Jesus at night in chapter 3, and then in chapter 7, he stands up to give a somewhat veiled defense of Jesus' practices. And yet, it is these two so-called secret disciples that publicly out themselves by burying Jesus in a family tomb with family wealth. The one who had been accused of sedition in a Roman court and blasphemy in a Jewish one. Commentator Craig Keener puts it this way: this story reveals Jesus' secret allies who, though at first lacking appropriate faith, now show more fidelity and allegiance to Jesus than those who have just celebrated their third Passover with him. Nicodemus may not expect reward from the now deceased teacher, but he now values honoring God above his own honor. One thing I find interesting in reading, in Jewish culture, do you know the one thing that is meant and shows the most honor you could ever give to anyone? It's being there and honoring them at their burial. And why is that? It's the one act that they cannot repay you for. And it's these two men who at personal expense, both relational and financial, seek to honor Jesus with their last mention in the Gospel of John. Regardless of where they had stood before, regardless of where the disciples had stood before, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus do it the right way, publicly outing themselves so that Jesus might have a proper and right burial. And that is something to take note of. Moving on, John chapter 20, verses 1 through 10. Confusion sets in, rightly so. Mary Magdalene shows the same care and concern we have seen from Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. As soon as she is able to, she is there to tend to Jesus' body. But what is missing from John's account? The synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all have Mary Magdalene at Jesus' tomb on Sunday morning, correctly, and yet in the other Gospels, she's not alone. Is this historical discrepancy? Is John rewriting history? Is he downplaying the devotion of care of the other women, which are named by the other Gospel writers? What is John doing by focusing in on Mary alone? He's zeroing in. He's showing us. He's bringing our attention to this one person. Remember, prior to following Jesus, Mary is really known for only one thing: demon possession. In Luke 8, we're told that she had 7 unclean spirits cast out of her by Christ. And as far as she knows, the one person who was able to give her deliverance and relief from the literal, emotional, and physical torment of evil spirits, that one person is now gone. So she comes. She comes early. She comes before the light of day, has even broken the horizon to care for Jesus. But what she finds is devastating. Notice the way John describes the scene. What does she see? She doesn't see the empty tomb. She doesn't see the grave clothes. She merely sees the stone rolled away and comes to the immediate conclusion that Jesus' body has been removed. Not resurrection, removal. You're probably aware that these stones were massive and would have been impossible to remove from the inside or even from the outside by a single person. So she assumes a coordinated desecration of Jesus' tomb during the night by those who wanted to keep it a secret. She literally runs to Peter and John to tell them what has happened. And they then what? Run back to the tomb. What they find there is equally astonishing. And John, the gospel writer, intentionally builds suspense for us. Mary merely sees the stone rolled away and leaves. John gets a little closer to look inside, but goes no further. It's when Peter arrives that we are finally made aware of what they saw. And it's in the detail here that John paints a miraculous picture. Notice how he describes the burial cloth. Folded up in a separate place, all by itself. If there's one thing I hope that you've picked up on as we walk through the Gospel of John, is the details and the significance of what John tells us in the details. Imagine hearing this story for the first time or actually being there in the moment. Wait, what? This is the least expected and the most extraordinary of details. If Jesus' body had been removed or stolen, what in the world are the grave clothes still doing there? And they are neatly folded? This is not the doing of a grave robber or one who wanted to desecrate a tomb. Who would neatly fold up grave clothes? Commentator D.A. Carson puts it this way: the description of the burial cloth suggests it had been neatly rolled up and set us to one side by the one who no longer had any use for it. Can you imagine seeing the grave clothes folded neatly right there? No thanks. I'm done with those. So miraculous a sight were the grave clothes that John actually points to this as the point of his own realization and belief. Seeing the grave clothes, seeing that they were folded, seeing how much care was taken for what had happened. And so he and Peter head back to the others to share with them what remarkable thing they have seen. But Mary stays there. And so our preparation, which turned to confusion, now turns to revelation. Mary Magdalene was one of the few who stood by the cross while Jesus was crucified. And now she stands outside the tomb, crying at the thought of not being able to care for her teacher and Lord in the dignified and honoring way in which she wanted. She is heartbroken. She is crying. But the narrative continues seamlessly as John and Peter leave. Mary stays. And as she is standing there crying, she now musters the courage for the first time to look into the tomb for herself. Remember, earlier she only saw the stone removed and then ran to tell the others. And what does she see? She sees something that Peter and John didn't see. She sees two angels sitting in the tomb where Jesus' body had been. In the Old Testament and into the New, the appearance of angels is a frightening experience. Those confronted with angelic beings tremble and shake and are undone by their own sinfulness and humanity and finitude. And yet, Mary seems altogether unaware at what she is seeing, and perhaps only even realized it later upon reflection. She is so focused on Christ, she doesn't even realize who is sitting there. She simply asks for Jesus, and she doesn't get a response, does she? What does she get? Still confused by it all, she assumes the gardener has arrived. This is not as surprising as in other post-resurrection accounts. Jesus is not immediately recognizable. Remember the road to Emmaus. These guys walk with Jesus for kilometers, not knowing who they were talking to, until Jesus had decided to reveal himself. True enough, the giver of all life is now standing before her, but she still doesn't realize it. She sees Jesus, but she doesn't yet know it's him. She doesn't know it's him until he says one word: her name. And in that instant, the anguish and despair of loss are instantly swallowed up by joy and delight. Forgive me for the reuse of a J.I. Packer quote from this summer. What matters supremely, therefore, is not in the last analysis the fact that I know God. Let me say that again. What matters not in the final analysis is the idea that I know God. But the larger fact which underlies it, the fact that he knows me. I am graven on the palm of his hands. I am never out of his mind. All my knowledge of him depends on his sustained initiative in knowing me. Friend, we take great comfort in knowing the God of the Bible, studying the God of the Bible, so that we can rightly discern what is true and what is false, so that we can rightly share with others the gospel and the hope that we have found in him. And yet, our assurance and our hope is not based upon our knowledge of him and his word, inasmuch it is based upon his knowledge and knowing us, and in taking us in to his family, in adopting us. It is in his initiative, not our own. He says her name in a way that she immediately recognizes who she is. And as he gives her direction to go and tell the others, we see two subtle allusions. The first, to her adoption into the family of God's kingly rule. Jesus tells her to go where? To my brothers, and that he is ascending to my Father and your Father. Jesus is now welcoming her in, not only as a disciple and a follower, but as a sister. Welcome to the family. It's started. The second allusion is to an Old Testament story that we read earlier in our service today. One that would have undoubtedly been read and repeated again and again amongst the women of Israel. Ruth chapter 1. As Naomi is lamenting the loss of her sons, and as her first daughter-in-law returns to her homeland, we see Ruth's response. She says, "Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people." And just as Jesus quotes to Mary, "Your God will be my God." Can you imagine the intimacy of the moment? Jesus is very intentional in choosing his words correctly and rightly so that the person hearing them knows he is speaking directly to him. He could have used any number of Old Testament allusions, any number of quotes from the Old Testament, the Psalms, the Proverbs, Genesis, Exodus, any of the prophets. But when he's confronted with Mary, who had been demon-possessed, destitute, shamed by her own culture, what is the passage he quotes to her? He quotes from Ruth. And he quotes a passage that says, "Welcome. You are mine." Mary sees this, she hears this, and she knows without question that she is Christ's. Do you know this? When you read through the scriptures, when you sing the songs, when you gather together to study the word, do you do so as one who has heard his voice in a way that only you would recognize, in a way that is most dear and precious to you? Because this is the way that Christ comes to us. I grew up in the church. I came to faith at quite a young age. I still have a mental picture in my mind of my twin brother and I, quite young, reading through the scriptures with my mother every night, praying with her that Christ would forgive both of us, that Christ would be ours, that he would be the Lord of our lives, my life. Quite a young age, walking with Christ through church, in church, knowing and reveling in what he had done for me. And yet, in college, I still remember as clear as day, I went to a small Bible college where we all learned the scripture in an academic setting all the time, and I loved it. But at the end of my freshman year, the choir at that time was doing a series of songs that had been written and based off of the devotional My Utmost for His Highest by Oswald Chambers, which is all about abandoning yourself to Christ. It's all about giving yourself in service, in full devotion to Him. And so at the end of this choir concert, like all good Baptist institutions, we had an altar call because that's what Baptists love to do. And I remember as scores and scores of my friends went forward to give themselves in service to Christ, to preach, to minister, to go wherever He wanted them to go, to do whatever He wanted them to do. The only thing I heard was, you are mine. Christ, in the midst of all that He was doing in calling men and women to service Himself, was simply calling me. And it was the most precious and lovely and life-giving experience of my life. I pray and hope and seek that you would know that you are His, and that you would walk, and that you would live, and that you would talk in light of all that He has done for you personally. So in giving Jesus a proper burial, we see those who hid out of fear now following publicly, and those who followed in the open now in hiding. And yet John doesn't mention Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea again, while the disciples who are in hiding right now will eventually come back out in boldness and sharing. So what are we to make of this? The human experience is complicated. Fear can drive us to do things that we knowingly don't want to do and would be ashamed of if you told us they would be part of our story. Our motives are suspect at best. And so our encouragement in seeing Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus is to follow Jesus, follow Jesus, follow Jesus again and again and again. And if you find yourself fixed on the shame of your fear, don't dwell on it. Follow Jesus. Do all He has asked you to do every day, every moment. His mercies are new every day. Follow Him. What are we to make of the confusion of events that cloud our thinking, stifle our passions, or leave us wondering how things could have turned out so poorly? What are we to do when things don't make sense? Look to Jesus alone. Come what may, whatever the outcome, whatever it means for my life or your family's life, look to Jesus. He is good and strong and kind, and in His own timing will show you the means and the matter of it all. My prayer is that you may see Jesus and hear His voice calling your name. May we be like Ruth and Mary Magdalene and all the saints who have gone before us, seeing Jesus, hearing His voice, and saying, wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God.